Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today is the fourth video in the 2666 series. Again, I'm reading this in sync with the Recognitions Book Club. I'll put the links below for the YouTube channel. I think that just got created today, so there aren't any videos yet, and I'm the first subscriber, so I feel really proud about that. But also Twitter and Goodreads, but most importantly on Instagram. Already, I'm a little bit ahead. This is the fourth video, but already for the first video, the part about the critics, the Recognitions Book Club has posted some great thought prompts and then also some questions, and so I really like the format there, and it's generating a lot of great discussion. A lot of really smart people out there who should be behind a camera talking just like this. This is the most notorious part of 2666, of Bolaño's entire career. This is the part about the crimes. This is where, after 3 parts of build-up and people from other parts of the world, in the first part from France and England and Spain, and then from the second part, New York, and then from the third part that we just finished from Chile and Spain. Now, like all these others, we have arrived. We have converged into the belly of the beast here in Santa Teresa, which is the fictionalization of Juarez, of course. This section is not really something that you read. It's unlike anything I've ever read before. It's a section that you live through. I would even go so far as to say that it is a section that you survive. Let's clear up a couple of things I've seen in some different book reviews and criticism of the time. I'm trying to stay close to the way people reacted at the time of its release, and then as a few years went on, and not necessarily today. But it is certainly not In Cold Blood, and it is not The Executioner's Song. Great book, by the way. If you wanted a fair comparison, I would say, along with several others, including the Recognitions Book Club, but also Wes Glover, who contacted me after reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian and posting a review on Goodreads. He called my attention to the connections between the two in their meditations on violence. I'll put the link to his review below. He's got some great thoughts on the attack against scientific materialism and the very bleak view of the world. It's really interesting. I think that using Blood Meridian as a comparative text to the part about the crimes makes for a really good study. Again, using Marcela Valdez's article, Alone Among the Ghosts, from The Nation in 2008. As she says, the part about crimes opens in January 1993 with a description of the corpse of a 13-year-old girl and ends 108 bodies later during Christmas of 1997. Each one of these forensic discoveries is clinically detailed. His descriptions of the murder investigations and of the incidents surrounding the trial of the chief suspect are equally precise and uncanny. So let's unpack each of those 3. First of all, I'm thankful that someone, I was certain that someone had done it, but I lost count. I was trying to keep track of how many bodies appear. According to Valdez, it's 108. I love to quantify things when I read, when I see that there's a list, which can get out of hand in certain books that glorify and praise a list. But for example, the litany of phobias that comes out, the catalog of misogynistic jokes. Within these sections, I like to tally them, but I lost count with the bodies, and really it was such a bleak enterprise. I felt sort of sick doing it. Note that she says that each one of these forensic discoveries is clinically detailed. Forensic discoveries and clinically detailed is perfect. Unlike the very detailed and visceral violence of certain novels. I'm thinking, of course, back again to Blood Meridian. It's been quite some time since I've read this. I may actually read this as soon as I'm done with 2666. But there's this brutality and this level of description that's graphic and unnerving. We don't get that. Bolaño instead takes this tack of giving us only what would appear on a coroner's report. And it's done with, like she says, this clinical detail that makes it even colder. Already we have a tough time dealing with the fact that these poor women, really these poor girls, are being killed so senselessly, and then just they're disappearing and their bodies are discovered later. But this is just another layer of abstraction that exacerbates the coldness of this senseless killing. On the one hand, I'm thankful that Bolaño didn't choose to really put our faces into the grit of these horrible atrocities. Rape especially is something that I have almost no tolerance for whatsoever. It shakes something at my very, very core. I'll never forget watching Gaspar Noé's Irreversible. It's a French movie. It's structured in a very artistically pleasing way, but everything eventually converges, everything that's going on, and it's one of these that starts at the end and works its way to the beginning. Everything converges on this awful scene of rape, and I since found out that actually the two people involved were married in real life. But just seeing that and just the pure evil of it really unnerves me, and I cannot handle it. And so in that way, I'm very thankful it doesn't go into these, to details like he could have. Since this is, after all, fiction, he has chosen to write a novel about these things. At the same time, however, there's something equally disturbing about this clinical way he does approach it. And so I think it's because of the sheer numerical volume. Instead of going into vicious detail, the violence and the force of the violence of these acts comes from the quantity of the corpses as they're piling up, which I find to be an even more effective measure. Because let's face it, as human beings, we are easily numbed and acclimated to things, even horrible things. And I would think that if Bolaño put us through 108 descriptions of excruciating detail, as he could have, even the most sensitive of us could possibly become calloused. The third thing that this points at, which he talks about how his descriptions of the murder investigations and all the incidents surrounding them are equally precise and uncanny. This is because of a figure who actually is in the pages of the book as Sergio Gonzalez, the Mexico City journalist. The story of the real life Gonzalez Rodriguez is fascinating. This guy literally put his life on the line. He was kidnapped and nearly assassinated, and he was stalked. And you can see, the more I've read now about Sergio Gonzalez and the things that happened to him in real life around his investigations of these femicides, the more I realize that a lot of those details permeate the text. The paranoia of Amalfitano. And as Valdez says, all such pointed mind games aside, any Mexican journalist writing about cartels or corruption would have felt vulnerable in 2004. That year, 5 investigative reporters were killed or disappeared in Mexico. One of them was shot to death in front of his 2 young children. According to a report put out by Reporters Without Borders, last year would have been 2007, Mexico has become the second most dangerous place in the world for journalists, the first being Iraq. 5 years into writing 2666, Bolaño and Gonzalez connected. In between parentheses, there's an article in here, Sergio Gonzalez Rodriguez and the Eye of the Storm, where Bolaño talks about when they met. And it gives some good insight into the writing of 2666. I'll just read some selections. A few years ago, my friends in Mexico got tired of me asking for information. More and more detailed information, too, about the killings of women in Juarez. And they decided, apparently by common accord, to hand the job over to Sergio Gonzalez Rodriguez, who is a novelist, essayist, reporter, and probably all kinds of other things besides. and who, according to my friends, was the person who knew most about this case. A unique case in the annals of Latin American crime. I don't remember now what year it was when I began to correspond with Rodriguez. All I know is that my fondness and admiration for him have only grown with time. His technical help, if I can call it that, in the writing of my novel, which I have yet to finish and don't know whether I'll ever finish, has been substantial. Out just now is his book, Huesos en el Desierto, or Bones in the Desert, a book that delves directly into the horror. Instead of being just an imperfect snapshot of wrongdoing and corruption, as of course it must be, Huesos en el Desierto becomes a metaphor for Mexico and the Mexican past and the uncertain future of all Latin America. It's a book not in the adventure tradition, but in the apocalyptic tradition, which are the only two traditions still alive on our continent. Maybe because they're the only ones that draw us closer to the abyss that surrounds us. Gonzalez has also subsequently talked about how during that meeting with Bolaño just told him, look, you're going to be a character in my novel and I'm going to use your name and there's nothing we can do about it. And this is in the midst of, death threats and stalking and having been kidnapped and nearly killed and all this. And Gonzalez says that Bolaño was, there were two things he noted about Bolaño. One, Bolaño had read everything. And two, Bolaño was completely insane. What genre is this section? Once again, it's completely different from its predecessor. Is it a funeral mass? Is it a dirge? Is it deadpan journalism? Is it a police procedural? Is it a crime noir? Well, piggybacking on what I just read from between parentheses, I would say that this is apocalyptic literature. Bolaño saw in these murders, in these femicides, something prophetic that would unlock something divine to explain everything that's going on in the world. Another way to think about it is a catalog of misogyny. And this is different from the catalog of misogyny in the satirical mode in Theroux's Darkenville's Cat, of course. The density and breadth of misogyny in this section is overwhelming. From minor manifestations, like, for example, the police will look at one of the corpses, one of the bodies, and they'll see that the girl was wearing a pair of pumps and they'll just say, oh, she was probably a prostitute. And then these kind of mid-level manifestations, for example, on page 438, there's this section with this compilation of chauvinistic jokes that get more and more brutal between law enforcement nonetheless. And these things, this shows just how deeply ingrained misogyny is in the culture. The major manifestations, of course, are the murders themselves. But Bolaño goes a little bit beyond just the femicides that are happening connected to the inexplicability that is warranting the investigation. And he includes all of these killings that have happened just from a result of domestic violence, just domestic disputes, disagreements. It's almost like he's saying, hey, look, there's a lot more. Yes, this is very novel that this volume of women that they're disappearing, but look, there's everyday violence against women going on here that haven't even made the papers. Why haven't they made the papers? Well, in 2010, in the fall issue of the South Atlantic Review, Laura Reinares has a great article called Globalized Philomels, State Patriarchy, Transnational Capital, and the Femicides on the US-Mexican border in Roberto Bolaño's 2666. She opens with the infamous Central Park 5 crime. Of course, now in hindsight, they've been acquitted. There's a lot we could talk about there, but she talks about that rape that happened in Central Park, and she shows how the socio-economic factors within a neoliberal patriarchy play into what gets attention and what doesn't. Because of course there are rapes all the time in Central Park, including right around the time of this one, but it was this one that stood out from the pack. And she says, Bolaño's monumental last novel sheds a tenebrous light on the way in which transnational patriarchy and the state have enabled the vicious deaths of disposable women. In order to reinforce these women's invisibility, Bolaño introduces, in part 4, the case of the church desecrator, a man who breaks into churches to urinate on their floors, prompting a more aggressive police investigation than the search for the biggest serial killer or killers in the history of Mexico. If we look at David Vishnar's territories of risk within tropological space from 0 to 2666 and back, he fuses Bolaño's concept of a territory of risk with Michel Foucault's concept of tropological space to show how the medium of fiction, when engaging with fear and violence, can sharpen their viewpoints by calling attention to the medium of writing itself. In the case of 2666, unwritability. And we've seen this before in the previous section where Oscar Fate is overhearing this conversation in a diner on his way to Santa Teresa, where a fellow is talking about how an incident where mass deaths that took place with slaves, and not hearing anything about those, with a death of some provincials that made headlines. And the reason being that they could be written, they were literate, but he was bringing attention to the unwritability. There wasn't a vocabulary for the slave deaths. Vishnar says the territory of risk is an area which, according to Roberto Bolaño, great literature must seek to inhabit, taking its readers where they don't wish to go. And that is exactly what he has done with me in part 4. Tropological space, according to Michel Foucault, is the structural condition of any such territory. For tropology is what marks off language as, in any cogent sense, literary, in that it exploits the word's ability to be turned away from their original meaning to take on a new one which is more or less removed, but that still maintains a connection. The core of 2666, its absent center, the blinding sun around which the planets of the various stories orbit, is precisely an illegible event to which Bolaño seeks to respond with his unwritable statement, the epidemic of female homicides in the area of Juarez. Bolaño rejects the writer's privilege of fantasy, preferring on the contrary the eeriness of complete exteriority, the deadening and deadened effect of relentless cataloging of deaths. Bolaño succeeds in restoring to physical violence something of its genuine evil and horrid banality. Time and again, Bolaño hints that what is happening in Santa Teresa is a symptom of a universal derangement in which hidden dimensions of reality are coming to light. And boom, that right there, that leads me, along with Wes Glover and the Recognitions Book Club, to connect back to Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian. In thematizing the problems entailed in writing the unwritten and possibly the unwritable, and in calling attention to the medium in which any such writing must take place, the literary treatment of notions of fear and fantasy, as presented in the case studies provided, offers a critical and active reflection on historical, social, and scientific issues while aesthetically exposing and problematizing conceptions and practices of violence. I think that these two studies are very important in a consideration of why Roberto Bolaño was, first of all, so obsessed with these femicides, beyond just being, moved by sympathy for what's going on and wanting to do something, but why he chose to write a novel about it. And why, furthermore, a novel like this one, with all of these different parts. Why the medium of fiction? What is this giant? These footsteps. We've got these showing up again, connecting back to the end of the previous part in a sublime encounter in prison. What is this thing that is haunting the world? For Bolaño, the key to what it is and what it is that is prophesying the reckoning with the abyss is to be found in these femicides.